Mark and Lisa had been married for 10 years. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but they were a team, or so Mark thought. They had a cozy house in the suburbs, 2 adorable kids, and a shared love for weekend getaways. Mark worked as an accountant, methodical and grounded, while Lisa, a marketing executive, had the charisma and spark that balanced their dynamic. But over the past few months, something had shifted. Lisa had always been attentive and warm, but now she seemed distracted, her laughter forced. She'd started working late more often, claiming urgent campaigns required her attention. Mark tried to be understanding, but the changes were hard to ignore. Lisa had become glued to her phone, smiling at texts she wouldn't share and shutting it off the moment Mark walked into the room. She'd bought new clothes, sleek dresses, expensive heels, and insisted they were just work necessities. "You're putting in so much effort lately," Mark commented one evening as Lisa walked in, her makeup still flawless after a late meeting. "Clients expect us to look our best," Lisa replied breezily, kissing him on the cheek before retreating to the shower. Mark tried to shake off his unease, chalking it up to paranoia. But doubts gnawed at him. He shared his concerns with his best friend, Jeff, over beers one Friday night. "You're overthinking it," Jeff said, taking a long sip. "Lisa's busy, sure, but that doesn't mean anything. Women go through phases, man." "Maybe," Mark replied, though Jeff's words offered little comfort. Things escalated the following week. Lisa had mentioned a late-night strategy session, but while scrolling social media, Mark spotted a photo posted by a mutual acquaintance. It showed Lisa at a trendy downtown bar, sitting across from a man Mark didn't recognize. Her expression was animated, her body language relaxed in a way that didn't feel professional. The caption read, "Great seeing old faces tonight." Mark's stomach churned. He stared at the photo for what felt like hours, his thoughts spiraling. When Lisa came home that night, he didn't confront her. Instead, he tested the waters. "How was the strategy session?" he asked, keeping his voice light. "Exhausting," Lisa replied, kicking off her heels. "We barely made any progress. I'm heading to bed." Her lie was a knife to the gut. Mark clenched his jaw, nodding as she disappeared upstairs. That weekend, Mark began noticing other anomalies. Lisa had a second phone charger she kept in her purse, even though she rarely ran out of battery. She'd started taking impromptu showers, her perfume lingering in the bathroom long after she left. One evening, she received a call while they were watching TV. She excused herself, stepping outside to talk. Mark followed discreetly, catching snippets of her whispered conversation. "I told you I'd call later," she said sharply. "No, he's home right now. Just wait." When Lisa returned, her expression was calm, but Mark couldn't unhear her words. The tension between them grew palpable. Lisa seemed oblivious, but Mark's suspicions were boiling over. On Monday morning, as Lisa prepared for another long day at the office, Mark made a decision. He'd follow her. He needed answers, even if they weren't the ones he wanted. He waited until Lisa left, then tailed her car at a safe distance. To his surprise, she didn't head toward her office but took an exit that led to the downtown area. Mark's pulse quickened as he followed her to a parking garage attached to a boutique hotel. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the concrete, and walked toward the elevator. Mark parked a few levels below and raced to catch up without being seen. From a distance, he watched as she entered the hotel lobby, greeting the doorman with a warm smile. She made her way to the elevator bank and disappeared inside. Mark stood frozen, torn between storming after her and retreating to his car. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Lisa. "Running late. Don't wait up for dinner. Love you." The audacity of her lie sent a surge of anger through him. Mark decided to wait, positioning himself near the parking garage exit. He needed to see who she was meeting. Hours passed. Mark's nerves were frayed by the time Lisa finally emerged, accompanied by a tall man in a tailored suit. They were laughing, their conversation too intimate for colleagues. Mark's stomach dropped as he snapped a photo from his phone, his hands trembling. The man looked vaguely familiar, but Mark couldn't place him. Lisa and her companion parted ways at their cars, and Mark followed her home. By the time she walked through the front door, she was humming softly, her demeanor relaxed and carefree. "Hey," she said brightly, setting her purse down. "How was your day?" Mark forced a smile. "Uneventful." "Yours?" "The usual," Lisa replied, disappearing into the kitchen. Mark's mind raced as he considered his next move. He had the photo, but it wasn't enough. He needed undeniable proof, something Lisa couldn't explain away. He'd opened Pandora's box, and there was no turning back now. The first thread of the web had been pulled, and Mark was determined to unravel the rest. Mark couldn't shake the image of Lisa and the man in the tailored suit. The photo on his phone was proof that something was amiss, but it raised more questions than answers. Who was the man? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why? The following morning, Mark awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. He decided he couldn't rely on intuition alone. He needed facts, evidence that could stand against any excuse Lisa might offer. His first step was to dig deeper into her recent behavior. Mark started by checking Lisa's social media accounts. Her profile seemed normal at first glance, photos of family outings, shared memes, and work-related updates. But something felt curated, almost sterile. There were no candid posts or check-ins at the trendy places she'd supposedly been visiting with colleagues. He scrolled further back, his eyes catching on a comment left on one of her photos by a user named Elliot James 87. The comment was innocuous, looking sharp, as always. But when Mark clicked on the profile, he felt his stomach churn. Elliot's profile picture matched the man from the hotel, the tailored suit, the smug smile. Mark scanned Elliot's posts. He was a financial consultant who frequently traveled and seemed to live a glamorous life. Buried in his recent photos was one tagged at the same boutique hotel. Mark's heart sank as he pieced together the implications. This wasn't a coincidence. Lisa's phone became the next object of Mark's scrutiny. That evening, while she was in the shower, Mark seized the opportunity. He opened her phone, using the passcode he'd memorized months ago, and quickly navigated to her messages. To his surprise, there was no incriminating conversation with Elliot, in fact, no messages from him at all. However, her call log told a different story. Elliot's name appeared several times, with calls lasting well into the night. Mark's stomach churned as he stared at the evidence. Before he could delve further, the shower turned off. Mark hastily put the phone back in its place, retreating to the living room. Lisa emerged moments later, towel drying her hair and smiling at him as though nothing was wrong. "Movie night?" she asked, plopping onto the couch. Mark forced a smile. "Sure." Mark's obsession grew. He ordered a small GPS tracker online and discreetly attached it to Lisa's car. The device was linked to his phone, allowing him to monitor her movements. Over the next few days, he watched as she visited her office, the gym, and, as expected, the boutique hotel. Each time, she stayed for hours before returning home, cheerful and chatty. Mark's breaking point came one Friday evening. Lisa had claimed she was meeting Mandy, her best friend, for drinks. But the GPS tracker showed her heading to the hotel again. Mark decided he couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed his jacket and set out to follow her. Mark arrived at the hotel and parked a few blocks away. He watched as Lisa stepped out of her car, her outfit more glamorous than usual. She walked into the lobby, greeting the doorman with familiarity. Mark waited for a few minutes before following her inside. The lobby was grand, with polished floors and soft lighting that exuded luxury. Mark kept his distance, pretending to check his phone as Lisa headed to the elevators. He saw her press a button, and the doors closed behind her. Mark's nerves were fraying. He had no idea what he'd do if he confronted her, but the thought of her betrayal drove him forward. He approached the reception desk, trying to appear calm. "Excuse me," he said to the receptionist. "I'm meeting my wife here, but I forgot the room number. Could you help me out?" The receptionist gave him a polite but wary smile. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't disclose guest information." Mark nodded, feigning understanding. As he turned away, he caught sight of a familiar figure entering the lobby, Elliot. Mark's blood boiled as he watched the man head toward the elevators with a bouquet of flowers in hand. Mark retreated to his car, his thoughts racing. He couldn't confront them here, not without proof that would force Lisa to come clean. As he sat in the driver's seat, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen to see a new email notification. The subject line read, "For your eyes only." Confused, Mark opened the email. The sender was anonymous, and the message contained a single line, "Be careful what you're digging for. Some truths can't be undone." Attached was a grainy photo of Mark sitting in his car, staring at the hotel. Mark's heart pounded as he scanned the street, searching for anyone who might be watching him. The warning was clear, but it only fueled his determination. Someone was trying to scare him off, and that meant he was getting close to uncovering something big. The next morning, Mark woke to find an envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a note written in blocky, anonymous letters, "You're not the only one being lied to." Below it was a printed photo of Elliot embracing a different woman outside the same hotel. Mark stared at the image, his mind spinning. Was Elliot playing Lisa, or was there more to this than he'd realized? The web was growing more tangled by the minute, and Mark was caught squarely in the center. He couldn't stop now. Not when the stakes were this high. The mysterious photo of Elliot with another woman threw Mark into a whirlwind of confusion. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just scratching the surface of something far bigger than a simple affair. Questions buzzed in his mind. Was Lisa aware of Elliot's double life? Was she being deceived, or was she complicit? Mark decided to escalate his investigation. Sitting alone in his dimly lit kitchen, he combed through the envelope again. The note's blocky handwriting seemed deliberately nondescript. He examined the grainy photo under a magnifying glass but found no clues. Frustrated but resolute, Mark resolved to dig deeper. The next day, Mark called in sick to work. He parked near the boutique hotel early in the morning and settled in for a long stakeout. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock amplifying his anxiety. Finally, in the late afternoon, his patience paid off. Elliot emerged, looking as smug and polished as ever. He wasn't alone. A woman, different from both Lisa and the one in the photo, clung to his arm as they laughed and walked toward a waiting car. Mark snapped photos with his phone, his heart pounding. Elliot was clearly no saint, but the nature of his relationship with Lisa remained unclear. As Elliot's car disappeared down the street, Mark's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up for dinner." Mark clenched his jaw. Her lies were becoming as predictable as they were infuriating. That evening, Mark's frustration boiled over. He confronted Lisa the moment she walked through the door. "Who's Elliot?" he demanded, holding up his phone with the photos of Elliot and the various women. Lisa froze, her eyes wide with shock. But instead of denial, a flicker of something else crossed her face. Guilt? "Mark, I can explain," she stammered, setting down her purse. "But it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Mark's voice rose. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with this guy while feeding me lies." Lisa's expression hardened. "It's complicated," she said. "I can't." "Don't give me that," Mark snapped. "Either tell me the truth, or this marriage is over." Lisa's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't speak. Instead, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving Mark seething in the living room. The silence between them the next morning was deafening. Lisa left early, claiming she had meetings, and Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He called Mandy, Lisa's best friend, hoping for insight. "Mandy, it's Mark," he began, trying to keep his tone casual. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Lisa lately?" Mandy hesitated. "Why do you ask?" I just feel like she's been distant, Mark said, choosing his words carefully. I'm worried about her. There was a long pause before Mandy replied. Mark, I don't know much, but Lisa mentioned someone from work helping her with personal stuff. She didn't go into detail, but it sounded intense. Maybe that's what's going on? Mark's grip tightened on the phone. Thanks, Mandy. I appreciate it. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Mandy knew more than she was letting on. He decided to monitor Lisa more closely. That evening, he installed a hidden camera in their home office, pointing it toward Lisa's desk. If she was communicating with Elliot, he'd have proof. Over the next few days, Mark checked the footage religiously. Most of it showed mundane activity, Lisa working on her laptop, taking calls, or scrolling through her phone. But one night, the camera captured something unusual. Lisa was on a video call, her voice low and urgent. I told you, this is getting too risky, she said, her face tense. Mark couldn't hear the other person's reply, but Lisa's response sent a chill down his spine. I can't keep lying to him. He's starting to suspect. The next morning, Mark followed Lisa again, his resolve hardened by the recording. She drove to the same hotel, but this time, instead of heading to the lobby, she entered a side door. Mark parked and followed on foot, keeping his distance. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Mark watched as Lisa knocked on a door. It opened, and she slipped inside. Mark moved closer, his heart pounding. The number on the door was 214. Suddenly, a voice behind him made him jump. Can I help you? Mark turned to see a hotel employee watching him suspiciously. No, Mark stammered. Just waiting for someone. The employee nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced, and walked away. Mark retreated to the lobby, unsure of his next move. He couldn't confront Lisa here without causing a scene, but the thought of waiting was unbearable. That evening, Lisa came home as if nothing had happened. Mark waited until she was asleep before checking the hidden camera. To his shock, Lisa's video call from earlier in the day had been with Elliot. But the conversation wasn't romantic or flirtatious. Instead, it sounded tense, almost combative. I'm not covering for you anymore, Lisa said. If he finds out, it's on you. Elliot's voice was faint but clear. Relax. I've got it under control. Mark sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just an affair. There was something much darker at play, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Mark felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, with no choice but to leap. Lisa's cryptic interactions with Elliot hinted at a web of secrets far more tangled than an affair. The tension between them had become unbearable, but Mark knew he couldn't confront her until he had the full picture. He needed the truth, no matter how ugly. The following day, Mark paid a visit to the boutique hotel. This time, he wasn't content to watch from the sidelines. He approached the front desk with a determined expression. Excuse me, he said. I believe there's been a mix-up with a room my wife was supposed to book. Can you check under her name? The receptionist gave him a polite smile. Of course. What's the name? Lisa Carter, Mark replied, his heart pounding. After a moment of typing, the receptionist frowned. I'm sorry, but there's no reservation under that name. Mark expected as much. What about Elliot James? He pressed. The receptionist hesitated. I'm afraid I can't disclose guest information. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. Thanks anyway. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of a housekeeper pushing a cart toward the elevators. On a whim, he followed her. The housekeeper stopped at room 214, the same room Lisa had entered days before. Mark lingered in the hallway, pretending to check his phone. When the housekeeper left, he approached the door, his heart pounding. He pressed his ear against it, straining to hear anything inside. You promised this would be over soon, Lisa's voice said, muffled but unmistakable. It will be, Elliot replied. As long as we stick to the plan. Mark's blood ran cold. What plan? That night, Mark confronted Lisa again. This time, he didn't hold back. I know about the hotel, he said as she walked through the door. I know about Elliot. Stop lying to me. Lisa froze, her face pale. Mark. Don't, he snapped. I've followed you, Lisa. I've seen the calls, the meetings. I've heard enough to know something is going on. Tears filled Lisa's eyes. You don't understand, she whispered. Then make me understand, Mark said, his voice breaking. Because right now, all I see is betrayal. Lisa sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, Mark thought she wouldn't speak. But then she looked up, her expression raw. It started a year ago, she said. I made a mistake. A big one. And Elliot, he found out. He's been holding it over me ever since. Mark stared at her, disbelief and anger churning inside him. What mistake? Lisa hesitated, then sighed. I borrowed money from someone I shouldn't have. A lot of money. Elliot works for him. When I couldn't pay it back, he offered a deal. Mark's mind reeled. What kind of deal? Lisa's voice cracked. I had to help him. Give him access to marketing data from my firm. It's illegal, I know. But if I didn't, they threatened to ruin me, to ruin us. Mark sank into the chair opposite her, his head in his hands. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a crime that could destroy their lives. Over the next few days, Mark tried to process what he'd learned. Lisa's actions disgusted him, but her desperation and guilt were undeniable. She had been trapped, manipulated by Elliot and his shadowy employer. Mark's anger began to shift focus. If what Lisa said was true, Elliot was the real villain. He had used her vulnerability to exploit her. Mark decided to confront Elliot directly. He arranged to meet him under the pretense of discussing Lisa's role in their dealings. They met at a quiet cafe, and Mark wasted no time. I know what you've been doing to my wife, he said, his voice low but firm. Elliot smirked. Is that so? You've been blackmailing her, Mark continued. Using her to do your dirty work. It ends now. Elliot's expression didn't waver. And what exactly are you going to do about it? Mark leaned forward. I've got evidence. Emails, phone records, even recordings. If you don't back off, I'll take it all to the police. For the first time, Elliot's smirk faltered. He leaned back, studying Mark. You're bluffing, he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Mark held his gaze. Try me. The confrontation left Mark shaken but determined. He didn't actually have the evidence he claimed, but Elliot didn't know that. It was a gamble, but one he hoped would buy them time. When he returned home, Lisa was waiting for him. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked smaller than he'd ever seen her. What did you do? She asked, her voice trembling. I told him to back off, Mark replied. If he doesn't, we're going to the police. Lisa's face crumpled. You don't understand, Mark. These people, they don't play fair. If you push them too hard, then we'll deal with it together, Mark said, his voice firm. I'm not letting him control you anymore. But as the days passed, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Lisa was still hiding something, and he couldn't rest until he uncovered the full truth. Mark's determination to uncover the full truth consumed him. While Lisa's confession had shed light on her entanglement with Elliot, it also left gaping holes. Her evasiveness suggested there was more to the story, more she was either too afraid or too ashamed to share. And Mark was done waiting. A week after confronting Elliot, Mark received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address scrawled in blocky handwriting. No explanation, no signature. Just an address in a rundown industrial district on the edge of town. Mark's instinct screamed at him to ignore it, but curiosity won out. He arrived at the address just before dusk. The building was an abandoned warehouse, its windows shattered and walls streaked with graffiti. As Mark approached, he noticed a black car parked nearby. It was Elliot's. Mark's pulse quickened as he slipped inside the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper inside. "You promised me it was handled," a man's voice said, sharp and impatient. "I'm working on it," Elliot replied. "But Carter's getting too close. He's not as clueless as you think." Mark crept closer, hiding behind a stack of rusted crates. Peering around the edge, he saw Elliot standing with another man, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek. The scarred man's face was twisted with irritation. "If he's a problem, then eliminate him," the man said coldly. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Eliminate him?" Mark's phone vibrated in his pocket, the sound deafening in the silence. He scrambled to silence it, but it was too late. "What was that?" Elliot snapped, spinning around. Mark bolted, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Behind him, he heard shouts and the pounding of feet. He burst out of the warehouse and dove into his car, peeling out of the parking lot as Elliot and the scarred man emerged, their silhouettes framed by the dim light of the warehouse. Back at home, Mark's hands shook as he locked the doors and windows. His mind raced. Who was the scarred man? What had Lisa truly gotten involved in? And how far were these people willing to go to protect their operation? Lisa found him pacing in the living room when she returned later that evening. Her face fell as she saw his disheveled state. "Mark, what happened?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Mark turned to her, his eyes blazing. "You need to tell me everything, Lisa. No more lies, no more half-truths. What aren't you telling me?" Lisa hesitated, then sank onto the couch, her shoulders slumping. "It's not just me they're blackmailing," she admitted. "Elliot works for a man named Victor Reed. He runs a network, stealing and selling corporate data. He's dangerous, Mark. People who cross him disappear." Mark's stomach churned. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Tears filled Lisa's eyes. "Because I was trying to protect you. If they thought you knew too much," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I couldn't risk it." Mark knew they couldn't stay silent any longer. The next morning, he called a trusted lawyer and arranged a meeting with the authorities. He presented everything he had, the GPS records, the hidden camera footage, and Lisa's testimony. It was a gamble, but one they had to take. Days later, the FBI raided the warehouse. Victor Reed was arrested, along with several of his associates. Elliot, however, was nowhere to be found. Life didn't return to normal overnight. Lisa faced consequences for her involvement, though her cooperation with the authorities earned her leniency. Their marriage, once built on trust and love, now stood on shaky ground. But Mark wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. "We have a lot to rebuild," he told Lisa one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "But if you're willing to try, so am I." Lisa nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and regret. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, Mark. I promise." Months later, Mark received an unmarked package in the mail. Inside was a single item, a burner phone. It buzzed as he picked it up, displaying a message that made his blood run cold. "Did you think this was over?" Mark's grip tightened on the phone as he stared out the window. The web may have been unraveled, but its strands still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to ensnare him again. The fight wasn't over, not yet.